Hey there, Sherwood. In this video, we'll look at the solutions to the homework that was given for part 2, where we have lines cut by transversal. So this is called a transversal that's cutting the lines, um, and the angle relationships for the angles that are formed by the transversal. Okay, and let's look carefully at the directions together. So it says lines A and B, which are here, are cut by transversal C. And it says they may or may not be parallel. All right, so we can't assume that they're parallel. In fact, I've even redrawn the figure in such a way that they don't exactly look parallel because we shouldn't assume that they are. It says to use the information provided to answer the questions, and we're supposed to justify answer using angle relationships. So let's look at problem 1 together. In problem 1, we're given the information that angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. And it says, can you determine if the lines are parallel? Justify using angle relationships. All right, so notice that angle 1 and 3 are vertical angles, so they're actually always congruent. And can we step back and look for a moment at that situation together? Okay, so here I've isolated the angles that are given as congruent, that are in those positions. And we see that the lines might actually be parallel, but on the other hand, they might not. Notice that these angles didn't ever change. They stayed the same, and yet the lines right now are nowhere near parallel. Okay? In fact, notice that as I drag this point up and down, these angles right here are changing, whereas these angles right here are staying the same. All right, so the summary is just because these angles are the same does not mean that these lines right here have to be parallel. Okay, so the answer to the question is angle 1 is just always congruent to angle 3 since they're vertical angles. This does not mean that the lines have to be parallel. Okay, problem 2 says that angle 4 is congruent to angle 7. So this angle here is congruent to this one right here. And we're asked, what do we know about lines A and B? Well, let's take a look. And again, we'll just step back and review just momentarily. The most important thing to understand about parallel lines is that when you translate one onto the other, the angles will match up. Okay, in fact, and let me just go back to this. Okay, so here's the visual where you see one moving on top of the other. Constantly keep that in mind whenever you're working with parallel lines. It's really the most important thing to know. All right, so getting back to this problem, we see that if you did that translation, 4 would map onto 7, so they're called corresponding angles. And since we know they're congruent according to the information that's given, the lines must, in fact, be parallel. So here's the solution to this problem. We've learned that if a pair of corresponding angles are congruent to each other, then the lines must be parallel, and that's exactly what we have in this problem. Therefore, the lines are parallel. Okay, problem 3 says, what if angle 2 is not equal to angle 7? In other words, what if this angle is different from this one right here? What can we conclude? Well, again, let's look at Sketchpad to help us with that. Okay, and so again, that's saying that this angle, angle 2, which was here, is different from this angle right here. Okay, and you can see in this figure the angles are different and the lines are not parallel, whereas if I move the lines so that they are parallel, now these angles are the same. So the conclusion is that the lines can't be parallel, because if they were, then these angles would match, but they don't. According to the information, those angles have to be different. All right, so that tells us that these lines can't be parallel. All right, let's see it again. Here it is. Here we have a pair of lines on alternate sides of C, so they're alternate angles. They're both in the exterior, the outside, so they're called alternate exterior angles. And we're told that they're different. so they're not congruent, and therefore the lines cannot be parallel. Okay, problem 4. In this problem, we're given that angle 3 is equal to angle 5. So these angles right here are congruent. And we're also told that 5 and 6 are the same. So this angle here is congruent to this one that's next to it. And we are asked, what do we know about the lines? Well, let's see if we can figure this out. From the fact that these two angles match, we'll look in Sketchpad at that. That amounts to saying that this angle matches this one. Well, that would tell us that the lines have to be parallel. All right, imagine translating this angle up to here so that they match. These angles are vertical, so they match. All right, so if all these angles are matching, then the lines are parallel. And so that's our first conclusion. The second conclusion is that if I know these angles are the same, something special happens. Right now they're different. Can I drag this until those angles match? They still don't match. Let me keep going. Okay, finally I got them to match. And can you see why they both have to be 90? That's because they're making a straight line. A straight line always has 180 degrees. And if they're equal, then they must both be 90. So in particular, these lines right here must be perpendicular. And that's our conclusion. All right, let's go back and see that summarized. Okay, so knowing that, let me just clear this off for you. Knowing that 3 and 5 are the same, 3 and 5, which those are on alternate sides of the transversal, so they're alternate. They're both in the interior of these two lines, so they're interior. Knowing that a pair of alternate interior angles are congruent, that tells us that the lines have to be parallel. So A, in particular, A is parallel to B. All right, secondly, and I'll clean this off again, with 5 being equal to 6, 5 equals 6, we do have a pair of linear angles, these are making a line, and since they're congruent to each other, and they make 180, they must both be 90 as we said before, and therefore those lines, namely C and B, must be perpendicular to each other. So those are our conclusions. A is parallel to B, and C is perpendicular to B. Okay, one last problem to complete this exercise. In this problem, we're told that angle 3 has measure 80 degrees. So let me go ahead and write that in there. We're also told that A and B are parallel, so we should assume that these lines are parallel. May not look it, but we're going to assume that's true. Okay. And we're asked to find the measure of angle 5. So let's see if we can figure this out. Well, if you translate this angle down to here, it would have to match since the lines are parallel. And now you're vertical from angle 5, so that would have to match. And we see that they're both 80 degrees. Excuse me for 1 second. Okay, so what that tells us is if I know this angle is 80, then we can figure out that this one is 80 as well. As long as you know the lines are parallel, that must be true. Okay, and the principle we're using here is that if a pair of lines are known to be parallel, then the alternate interior angles have to be congruent. These are alternate interior, so they've got to be congruent. Okay, and that finishes off the set of problems in part 2 of this homework assignment. I hope that that helps you to understand how you'd be expected to respond here, how to justify your answers, and we'll look at part 3 in a moment. See you next time.